Democracy is a chorus. It hands a microphone to every citizen. And in that act of giving equal breath to all, it promises truth through persuasion and consent. Yet in the same breath, it can turn judgment into a contest of opinions, and a city into a theater where the most persuasive voice plays the crowd like an instrument. Socrates, a man who trusted questions more than certainties, looked at the spectacle and felt a tremor run through the bones of philosophy. He did not fear the idea of government itself as much as the way it comes alive in the public square when fear, vanity, and momentum ride the podium. Socrates understood that every republic rests on a fragile contract. We will govern ourselves by shared reason, by dialogue, by a disciplined willingness to revise what we think we know. But humanity is not a perpetual audience for reason. It is also a theater of desire, pride, and impulse. In such a theater, democracy can magnify the virtues of the many. It can also magnify the errors of the many when they are not checked by the patient scrutiny of a few who insist on the demand for evidence, the slow liturgy of the question, the stubborn disavowal of certainty. He spent his life asking questions that others prefer to answer aloud. What is courage? What is justice? What makes a life worth living? And he learned that truth rarely arrives in a single verdict, but in a patient, iterative conversation. He believed that wisdom begins in acknowledging how little we know, and that the only shield against tyranny of the many is the discipline to test every claim against reason and experience. In a democracy, that shield is supposed to be the law and the forum of test and countertest. Yet the same democracy creates a new risk. The crowd can become a supermajority that mistakes speed for wisdom, certainty for truth. Think of a ship that sails with 1,000 oarsmen shouting directions. A captain might be grateful for the united effort, but when every oarman speaks at once, the ship veers or it stalls, or it begins to row toward a reef while everyone believes they are steering toward the horizon. Socrates saw Athens as that ship moment by moment, a city with extraordinary courage and terrible susceptibility to fear. In emergencies, the crowd wants immediate answers, not the patient work of examining premises. It wants a hero with a simple story, a ritual that feels like justice, a verdict that sounds final. The fear was not ignorance alone, but the speed with which ignorance can become policy. Democracy makes it possible for a persuasive demagogue to outpace the sober citizen who sits with a book and a lamp, who weighs the costs of war against the cost of wisdom, who knows that a policy born of panic often costs more than it saves. Socrates warned that a system blessed with equality before the law can still produce inequality of outcomes if the deliberative muscle is weak or absent. If you vote without understanding, you might as well cast your lot with a rumor rather than with a reason. And so he found himself on the edge of danger, not because he doubted the virtue of the city, but because he distrusted the city's capacity to resist its own intoxication. The Athenian assembly could be generous, and it could be cruel. It could honor a thinker who challenged tradition, and it could crush a thinker who challenged its appetite for certainty. In this sense, democracy is a double-edged gift. It unlocks the door to reform, and it opens a corridor where reform can degenerate into fashion, where novelty looks like wisdom, and wisdom looks like resistance to all novelty. He was accused not merely of poisoning the youth or of impiety, but of cultivating a dangerous habit in the citizen. To think for oneself in a public square where courage is measured by conformity to the loudest voice. The trial, as it unfolded, revealed a deeper truth about democracy. When a crowd is sovereign, justice becomes a craft of persuasion, not a science of proof. If you cannot defend your position by reasons that survive critical scrutiny, the verdict can hinge on the mood of the moment, on who speaks with most certainty, who can cry out loudest about the corruption of the city, and how swiftly punishment should follow. Socrates did not fear death as much as the loss of the space where questions can breathe. He cared more about the idea that a city's soul is formed not in the heat of a single victory, but in the slow, honest practice of living with questions that do not yield to applause. If democracy is to endure, it must tolerate dissent. And dissent must be grounded in a shared reverence for truth, not merely the shared breath of crowd. He saw a future where the exact same mechanism that enables freedom participation, debate, education could be weaponized by fear to justify impulse, into a pattern where policy becomes spectacle, and the citizen becomes a spectator to his own influence. The paradox can be illustrated by an ancient image, a marketplace of ideas, vibrant and noisy, with no single voice authorized to declare what is true. If the crowd is the sole sovereign, a single erroneous rumor can become law before it is weighed. If the state seeks to protect itself from error by silencing those who question, it betrays the very premise that gave it life. Socrates believed in the power of the question to reveal the illusion of certainty, yet he recognized that a democracy without a disciplined culture of inquiry could devolve into a ritual of voting away thought itself. Consider the consequences he feared. Political violence that follows the conviction that truth is decided. Citizens who are trained to obey instead of to reason. Philosophers who are replaced by polemicists who excel at fear-mew and clever refrains rather than the patient work of argument. In such a world, a city could applaud its own moral simplicity while quietly trading long-term wisdom for short-term relief. Socrates did not worship doubt for its own sake, but he worshipped the method by which doubt can refine belief. He feared a democracy that forgot the method, that embraced certainty when certainty was absent, that rewarded speed over the fidelity to truth. There is also a more intimate fear, hidden in the margins of public life. Democracy invites the crowd to define virtue, but it leaves open the question, who defines virtue when the crowd cannot? The wise city cannot be fully formed by those who shout the loudest or by those who promise to protect the majority from discomfort. It requires that the minority be heard with respect, that alternative futures be sketched with care, that policy be tested against potential harm rather than immediate relief. Socrates warned that without such restraint, the very concept of the good could be bent toward expedience, and the city could become less about the pursuit of virtue than about the approval of the majority. So the fear was not a blind opposition to democracy, but a cautious warning about its hunger. Democracy eats quickly if fed by fear, and it forgives slow thinking only when the thinkers among us are ready to lead with humility. Socrates knew that leadership in a republic is not the triumph of a single mind, but the alignment of many minds toward a common, redeeming aim. To govern with wisdom when wisdom is scarce. To defer to the better argument, even when it costs comfort. To accept that the truth may require months and years, not minutes on a clock. Yet there is a hopeful thread in his caution. If a democracy can falter when it forgets the discipline of inquiry, it can also rise when it remembers the power of a shared question. A city that trains its children to ask why, and trains its elders to listen to why, becomes harder to move by fear and easier to move by insight. Socrates' fear becomes a guide if we treat it as an invitation to build institutions that protect minority voices, to maintain spaces where doubt is not a threat but a civic duty, to ensure that votes are informed by a persistent, everyday education in philosophy and science. The modern world keeps re-asking this ancient dilemma. In an age of rapid information, the crowd can form opinions at the speed of a post, and policy can orbit around viral narratives rather than enduring reasoning. The fear has evolved, but the question remains. What kind of democracy do we want to inhabit in the year 2025 or 2050? Do we want a democracy that prizes speed and certainty above patient truth-seeking? Or do we want a democracy that trains its citizens to be skeptics without becoming cynics, to be courageous enough to change their minds, and to hold leaders accountable for clarity as much as for courage? That is the inheritance Socrates left us. Not a rebellion against democracy, but a demand that democracy be a bloodstream of reflection as well as a river of sentiment. If we forget this, we risk becoming spectators in a drama we once authored, applauding the moment while surrendering the patient work that keeps a city humane. If we remember, perhaps the fear dissolves into a vow. To cultivate a culture where the most democratic act is not to vote for the loudest voice, but to engage in the hardest conversation, to test a claim against a rival claim, to prefer the skeptical beam of light over the overpowering glare of certainty. In that sense, Socrates' fear is not a denial of democracy, but a compass for it. It asks us to balance participation with deliberation, passion with prudence, impulse with argument. It asks us to honor the courage of a citizen who speaks up, and to honor the courage of the citizens who listen. It asks us to recognize that the city's fate does not hinge on the triumph of a single moment, but on the stubborn, quiet work of truth-tellers, educators, and questioners who keep the flame alive long after the roar has faded. If we can hold fast to that balance, the democracy we inherit may endure not because it never falters, but because it learns to correct its course when it does. It may not always feel like victory, but it can still feel like meaning. It can still feel like a city willing to admit its errors and to seek a better future anyway. And perhaps, in that stubborn effort, we honor the true spirit of Socrates, a reminder that wisdom begins where certainty ends, and that the best democracy is one that does not fear the questions it asks. Open questions, then, about the price of freedom, the virtue of inquiry, and the fragile beauty of a city that dares to think aloud. What if the courage we need is not the courage to declare a verdict, but the courage to test it again? What if the real safeguard is a citizenry that refuses to mistake agreement for truth, and refuses to mistake doubt for weakness? If we choose that path, we may discover that Socrates did not fear democracy to condemn it, but to redeem it through perpetual, fearless inquiry. In the end, the question lingers, not as a shout to be resolved, but as a beacon to illuminate our next conversation. What kind of democracy are we willing to become when we meet its greatest test? That the majority, delayed by hesitation and sharpened by reason, chooses wisely not once, but again and again. As the city grows and learns to tell the truth from the noise, open your ear, then your mind. The road to wisdom in a democracy is never paved with certainty, only with the stubborn, patient work of truth-seeking citizens. That is the legacy and the risk Socrates would have